Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm your host, AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Michael Hahn. He's a theologian and medieval church historian, and his main area of focus is early Franciscan mystical theology. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Amanda. Happy to be here.
So today you're here to speak to us about Angela of Foligno. But before we talk about her, I want to talk about you. So how did you first find mysticism as a topic of study?
So, going into theology as an undergraduate student, my main interests in religion were looking at how someone's interior thoughts or their spirituality became actualized and had an impact in the world. And so from that, I was attracted to studying church history at the end of my second year of undergraduate. And that coincided with the arrival of William Hyland at St Andrews, where I studied, who I then studied monastic spirituality with, Christian mysticism, and medieval theology. So through studying with him, I was really introduced to looking at medieval spirituality, which became my main focus.
So your interest in mysticism came out of your interest in spirituality, which came out of your interest in theology. But what is it about this particular area that you think really drew you in?
I think the way in which it is a very legitimate form of theology, but also shows that in order to be doing theology in the Middle Ages, you don't have to be sat at a university or in a scriptorium of a monastery. And I think by studying medieval spirituality, you're given a greater perspective of that.
And I think as listeners will find out in the course of this podcast, Angela of Foligno definitely fits into this category of people who were working outside of the scholastic system, but still really engaging with theology. So let's talk about her now. Can you start by telling us a little bit about her as a mystic?
In any sense of the word mystic or mysticism, Angela really falls into that category. She's someone who very explicitly describes her own visions and own experiences, sort of ecstasies, dreams, but also someone who employs language in a very specific way. She often juxtaposes apophatic and cataphatic theology, so saying something affirmative about God and then negating it straight away, and really very clearly someone who believes that she has had some kind of direct consciousness of the presence of God, to kind of borrow Bernie McGinn's term. She has to really be counted as a mystic and as an important figure in its history, both for her experiences and her writing.
Can we pause with Angela for a second, and can you jump back and give us a quick definition of what apophatic and cataphatic theology really means? Because, as you mentioned, they're quite important to Angela's work.
Apophatic theology attempts to talk about God by saying what God is not, or negating the sort of statements of God, or a way of claiming that we can't affirm anything about God, and so the only way to say anything is to negate the affirmations. And one thing that scholars such as Michael Sells have argued is that mystics were not necessarily people who were talking about experiences, but people who used the combination of apophatic and cataphatic language to say something about the unknowability of God, so that you kind of posed a statement about God and negated it and negated that. And in that process, the sort of mind of the person hearing this is brought to kind of a state of flux in which something meaningful about God can be said in that sort of temporary moment of negating and negating and negating again.
So attempting to say what God is by saying all of the things that he's not, but then saying the things that he is just to contradict yourself and say that that's not right either. This seems like a really difficult way to communicate her experiences and her understanding of the divine. What other methods does she use to try to convey her ideas and experiences?
I think for her, she does use a lot of very poignant metaphors, but eventually she feels that they all fall short of what she wants to say about God. And as she draws closer into what she would consider a union with God, or perhaps deiformity, she sort of loses all of these previous metaphors and then brings in the metaphor of the abyss, which in some ways is sort of a contained nothingness, you might say. Abyss literally being depthlessness or groundlessness. It is sort of nothing in a contained manner.
A great big ball of nothing.
Yes.
So I'm sure we'll return to the abyss shortly, as ominous as that sounds. But let's establish a little bit more about Angela first. So what do we know about her life?
Yes, so Angela was born probably around the middle of the 13th century. We don't know a specific date for her birth. She lived in Foligno, which is less than 20 kilometers from Assisi. So she was really in this sort of center of the Franciscan Revolution. Francis of Assisi founded the Order of Lesser Brothers and the Franciscan movement more widely at the start of the 13th century. And so Angela, living so close to that, was really part of that wider movement and had access to this great resource that is Umbria in that period. So she's someone who, towards the end of the 13th century, probably around 1285 or a little before, who really converted to a life that can be aligned in some ways to the Franciscans. So a life of penance, of poverty. She had this great fear of damnation and wanted to avoid it at any cost and wanted to learn how to avoid that. So she prayed to Francis after he died to ask to find her a suitable confessor. And from that point on, kind of aligns herself to the friars in Foligno and in Assisi. So she's someone who has traditionally been thought of as the tertiary Franciscan, or belonging to the third order. But now we know, due to scholarship from people like Alison Moore, that such an order didn't officially exist at that point. But regardless of that, Angela really aligned herself to the Franciscan ideals. So she's very different in lots of ways from the early friars, but she nonetheless, I think, held Francis as a particular exemplar. You might say that she had maybe Christ as the most exemplary figure, followed by probably Mary, John, and Francis on the same level. So to identify Francis as similarly authoritative as the Virgin Mary or St. John is obviously quite a big deal. So she, as I said, was living in Umbria and had this sort of conversion towards the Franciscan way of life towards the end of the 13th century.
And do we know why she decided this moment to make this conversion? Was there any particular reason?
Yeah, the main thing is her fear of damnation. We're not told anything sort of specific that happens to cause that. We're kind of given the impression that she's someone who liked very luxurious things, liked fine clothes and fine foods. And we're not told a very specific event or reason as to why she wants to suddenly denounce that. But really she has this general fear of hell and fear of damnation that causes it.
But we do know that she experienced a lot of loss within her own family leading up to her spiritual journey.
Near the start of Angela's conversion, or what we might call her spiritual journey, Angela's mother, all her children, and her husband die in quick succession of each other. And then Angela, quite shockingly, says that this is a great thing, and she's very happy it happened because she prayed for it, and that means that she can be so much closer to God, which obviously to us sounds quite shocking. That does happen, I think, a little way into her spiritual journey. It's not kind of a point that starts it for her. And I think that it does, in some ways, tell us a lot about sort of the difficulty it would have been to have lived with a medieval mystic. You can imagine sort of people who want to spend all of their time alone contemplating, or have days on end wrapped in visions of God, would not be the ideal people to live with. And you can imagine how having a husband, a mother, and children who are all really dependent on you would really impede your progress in that way, as far as Angela was concerned. Although she does later say that the deaths of her mother and her children were incredibly painful for her. So it's perhaps not quite as one-sided as the initial quote would have people think.
So the deaths of her mother and children were painful, but not her husband.
Yes, interestingly, she doesn't ever say how painful it was for her that her husband died, which quite a lot of people have picked up on and wondered sort of why that was. But I think there's no particular textual evidence to suggest why.
Does she marry Jesus instead?
She believes she does, yes. So that's kind of her desire from pretty early on in her journey, is through this sort of classic language adapted from the Song of Songs, whereby Angela believes that she is the spouse of Christ. At one point, she envisages herself being given the ring of Christ, very much that she's wedded to him. She also uses a lot of quite erotic language. She talks about being alone with Christ in the darkness, but also she takes up the metaphor that the cross is her bed, the bed she's born on, the bed that she marries Christ on, and the bed she dies on. So in some ways, that's a very erotic or spousal imagery. In another way, it's a very compassionate metaphor. The fact that her life on this sort of married bed with Christ is one of acknowledging Christ's suffering, but also at the same time feeling that she is suffering the same pain as him.
So does her work describe a lot of suffering? Is it a focus of her text?
Yes, so she's definitely a proponent of what we would call compassionate spirituality, where someone feels that they suffer in a comparable way to Christ, or they feel the actual pain of Christ. So taking Mary and John as exemplars of that, sort of standing at the foot of the cross, but actually feeling the pain of Christ at the same time. And she at times says that her body dislocates. And I think she says that quite a few times in her text. And so she's someone who feels that there's this very actual physical pain happening because of that.
So mystics all experience the divine in different ways. How does that start for Angela, and how does it kind of function in her life?
Yes, so often Angela, at least earlier on in her spiritual journey, has particular sort of earthly stimuli for that. So she's very impacted by images. One of the most memorable events, certainly, is when Angela enters into the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, and she notices a stained glass window in the Basilica and instantly falls to the floor, screaming and crying for her sort of pain of losing the presence of God. And I think what's, to me, one of the most notable things about that is that she sees this stained glass window, which depicts on one side Christ holding Francis, and on the other side, the Virgin Mary holding Christ. And her vision is of God telling her that he will hold her closely. And so for me, it's not just that she has seen something and that's sort of invoked a vision in her, but the actual content of what she has seen has had a very real impact on the experience she claims to have had.
So there's a direct correlation between the image that inspires the vision and the vision itself.
Yes, definitely. But otherwise, Angela has rather an odd or disrupted way of talking about her relationship with God. At times, she feels she is receiving beatific visions, and other times she's entirely distraught and feels she's been completely abandoned by God. So while some other people who talk about journeying into God talk about quite a simple and quite a neat journey, for her, it's very much kind of an oscillation in which she is sort of rising, as it were, into God, but really between two poles, where she's completely distraught on one side and then completely ecstatic on the other.
Is there some sign of progress, or is it just a constant back and forth?
There definitely is progress, and it's both the suffering she endures and the sort of glorification or union with God grows stronger and stronger throughout. So towards the start, God tells her that he's only given her sort of a very small gift of himself for now, because that's what she's capable of handling. But then towards the end, we see her on the sort of negative side say she feels like a man hanged by the neck with no support. But then on the positive side, she feels that she is standing or lying in the midst of the Trinity.
That's a rather dramatic difference. So you mentioned that Angela is a lay penitent Franciscan, or at least that she adheres to their theology and values. How is she received by her Franciscan contemporaries?
Quite mixed. So she has one particular relationship with a relative of hers who we're told is called Brother A. Some later manuscripts refer to him as Brother Arnaldo. And Friar A sees Angela fall to the floor of the basilica crying and screaming and tells her never again to return to Assisi. So he's initially very disapproving of her, but when he's relocated to Foligno, we're told, the town he's from, he begins to take down notes of Angela's confessions to him, and he says this is because he wants to see if she's possessed by the devil. So which I mean is something certainly that no male mystic I'm aware of had the sort of indignity of being asked about in that manner. I mean, you have lots of people like maybe Eckhart on one hand or Francis of Assisi on the other, who receive a lot of doubt from ecclesiastical authorities in one way or another. But I can't recall any of them or any other male mystics being accused of demonic possession.
Oh, but not Angela. She throws herself on the floor of one basilica, crying and screaming. And Brother A's right there being like, she's probably possessed by demons. I should start writing this stuff down.
Yes, but then he says he's so impressed with her that he continues to write this. And this becomes the first part of Angela's book, which is called The Memorial, or that's the name modern editors have given to it. So this is a sort of step-by-step account of Angela's spiritual progression to and into God. So in some ways, kind of similar to Bonaventure's The Soul's Journey into God, but it's much more biographical or perhaps even hagiographical. Bonaventure's text is quite hypothetical, very much about sort of the mind's progression, whereas Angela is really about her progression as a person, as well as her sort of interior progression. So it's really sort of her failings and her faults as well as her successes. It's a very kind of human account, I guess, of a 13th century mystic.
Okay, so it's about her and her specific journey rather than laying out some sort of universal ladder.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. In some ways, is presenting her as a figure to imitate, but at the same time, isn't saying this is exactly what you should do. I think there are certainly some points of Angela that Brother A would point to as exemplary, but there are lots of other things. For example, I think when she says she starts to set parts of her body on fire, he's very quick, as you would hope, to tell her not to do that. And you can tell that's not the sort of thing that he wants to encourage from people. She's also someone who is, I think, frequently told by Brother A, among others, we're told, that she shouldn't perform this sort of radical sense of poverty that she wants to. And I think in some ways she has a very fraught relationship with the other friars. There are certainly other friars in Umbria who are supportive of her. We're not kind of told names, but there's more than Brother A. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are very obviously opposed to her, and people who tell Brother A he shouldn't be involved with her and he shouldn't be writing her texts. At one point, we're told, kind of entertainingly, that he's been told not to be involved with her, and so he has to get a small child to write down the notes instead of himself. And so Brother A comments how badly written this section is because it was by a small child. And I think that relationship with the friars is a really good example of the ecclesiastical status of penitential women at this point, which is, as Alison Moore has argued, at least in this period after 1289, is that they've often professed a rule which says that they should sort of take the friars as support for them, but the friars have absolutely no ecclesiastical obligation to support these women. And so I think we often have that sense that some of these friars think that at least Angela's sort of very performative, very mystical style is not necessarily what they want to support or what they want in their communities or associated with them. Nevertheless, she's someone who does inspire a great interest among her contemporary Franciscans. Obviously, Brother A, but also quite famous names like Jacopone of Todi or Ubertino of Casale are people who are very interested in her. So she has a very fraught relationship with the Franciscan friars at that point.
Okay, so what we're learning from Angela, or at least from Brother A, is no radical poverty, no crying and screaming, and don't set yourself on fire.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so what does he want us to get out of her text and her life?
I guess what Brother A would want us to sort of think about Angela in a positive way is firstly sort of the contemplative state. And for Angela, she sees as being entirely a gift from God that she's able to enter this relationship, and it's entirely the will of God. But at the same time, she uses, as I say earlier, very visual stimuli to sort of affect this, also a deep compassion for the suffering of Christ. And I think that's a really key kind of Franciscan component at this point, perhaps equally as important as poverty, is that it's always about an imitation of Christ. So we're poor because Christ was poor, and we kind of contemplate interior poverty because Christ went through a process of impoverishment in kenotic incarnation. But also it's very much a focus on the passion. So a contemplation of his suffering. And that's, I think, a really key component of understanding Franciscan spirituality in this period, which is perhaps why Brother A is so sort of happy to recommend Angela as far as that state goes.
So he's a fan of her as a contemplative, but lesser so the performative aspects of her devotional practice.
Yeah, so I think she's someone who is kind of not quietly sitting in a corner all the time. She's someone who doesn't really mind causing a scene, as we saw with her falling on the floor in the Basilica of St. Francis. At the same time, she's someone who is quite hesitant to give away what she might think of as her secrets or her knowledge of the divine, and will often take a lot of persuading to tell people about that. So yes, she is someone who in some ways is very performative, but in others is very private about the illumination she receives. And I think that for a lot of mystics, and I think this is true of Angela as well, the illumination they receive is not simply for them, but for the entirety of Christendom. But I think Angela is definitely hesitant about sharing her experiences at times. And perhaps her very sort of negative experiences with some of the friars in Assisi and Foligno is perhaps reason for not wanting to divulge that to other people.
So she didn't always get along with the friars, but she did develop a following of sorts.
Yes, so Angela was someone who gained quite a lot of followers. Even fairly early on in her spiritual journey, she had a kind of community around her. And these are men and women, including friars, who saw her as this theological teacher or spiritual teacher. And I think that's quite something for a 13th century laywoman to be considered a teacher of theology. You know, she's not a university master, she's not an abbess, she's a laywoman. So for her to be considered that is quite remarkable. So these are people who really kind of follow her and follow her teachings, and quite probably also the people who wrote down the second part, or I should say parts of her book, which is now commonly referred to as the Instructions.
I do want to get back to the composition of her texts, but can you tell us a little bit more about her as a spiritual teacher?
In some ways, we don't necessarily have specific hagiographical accounts of Angela teaching to loads of people, but we do have examples in the text of her followers who are writing down the so-called instructions for her, talking about her in that kind of language. And certainly quite quickly after her death, we have additions to the text which referred to her as Doctrix Disciplinae Dei, teacher in the discipline of God, which comes from Wisdom 8:4, I think. And then within 315 years of her death, we start to see her referred to as Magistra Theologorum, so teacher of theologians. So these are quite heady titles to be given to a 13th century laywoman. As I say, she's not a master at university, she's not an abbess. So while there are some 13th century women who could very legitimately be seen as teachers by sort of ecclesiastical authorities, or at least within their own monastic communities, Angela has sort of no official ecclesiastical standing in that sense.
So her only authority is coming from the people who followed her.
Yes, and she would claim from God as well.
Well, of course. So let's return to her works then. You were mentioning that there are two parts.
So you have the memorial as the first part of the book, which is one text. We now think of it as jointly being written by Angela and Brother A. So she was kind of providing the input and he was writing it down and forming it in the way that he wanted. The second half of the overall book is a collection of texts, so definitely not one text, but a collection, which are commonly grouped together now under the title The Instructions. So these texts really range in genre, they're hagiographies, letters, prayers, and they're written down by various followers of hers. So we can't tell very much if there are several instructions written by the same scribe. It's very difficult to tell that, but we know that they are written by several people. And these followers are kind of drawn up to Angela and her status as a theological teacher and as a theologian. And if I can just share one brief passage from the Instructions, which I think is really important. Firstly, in that it tells us about the role Angela's followers or her spiritual sons have in her theology, but also that we need to consider Angela, yes, as a mystic, but also as a theologian. And so Angela has a vision while she's in Assisi, in which she says she is absorbed into the abyss, or she undergoes an abyssal absorption into God. In that state, she receives a vision of her spiritual sons. And she says, "My sons seem to be transformed in God, that it is as if I see nothing but God in them, in both his glorified and suffering state, as if God had totally transubstantiated and inabyssated them into his light." And for me, that says a lot of important things about Angela. Firstly, that she's using the language of transubstantiation to talk about union with God, which is incredibly radical. And even people like Marguerite Porete, who offer a very radical sense of annihilation, don't go as far as to use transubstantiative language. Scholastic debates around whether the language of annihilation was appropriate were common in this period. So to ask, is the bread and wine of the Eucharist completely annihilated in itself when it becomes the body and blood of Christ? And that seems to be the language that Angela is sharing here, when she's expressing her thoughts that her spiritual sons seem to have been entirely annihilated in this process of becoming Christ-like or deiform. And similarly, it tells us a lot about her sense of abyss language. As I said earlier, the abyss sort of has a special place in Angela's theological arsenal, in that it kind of overtakes her other metaphorical uses. And in this sense, we have her talking about not just the abyss, but kind of a process of becoming what we might call abyssated or inabyssated. The idea that one can really be drawn into the abyss. And I think that's quite notable in this context, because for both Francis and Clare of Assisi, several of their hagiographers referred to the process of their dying, they wanted to say it was a kind of a permanent or eschatological union with God that they were going into, which is kind of stronger than any of the union they had experienced, or certainly most of the union they had experienced in this lifetime. And the hagiographer described that as an abyssal absorption. They were absorbed into the abyss of divine light or eternal light or divine clarity. And so I think for Angela to be describing herself as having a vision which was to be absorbed into the abyss in this lifetime kind of says something about the radical nature of the union she felt she had with God, that while she was still alive on earth, she would claim to have these really strong expressions or strong feelings of this sort of permanent or eternal union with God.
So falling into the abyss is a good thing?
It depends. In a lot of places in the Old Testament, abyss language is something which is in reference to hell or uncreated matter or darkness. So we think about Genesis, darkness was on the face of the abyss. But then we also have other examples, like Psalm 41:8, abyss calls to abyss, which received a lot of medieval commentary on how abyss calls to abyss is really the abyss of God calling to the abyss of the human. Abyss, in this sense, kind of meaning the very core, but kind of beyond the core of the person. So kind of beyond the core of someone's being, they're kind of tied to beyond the core of God's being. I think that sense of abyss language has a lot of influence for Angela in this way, but it is a way of talking about being really drawn into God's being, the very kind of core of God's identity.
So for Angela, the abyss is a good thing.
Yes. Yes. For Angela, the abyss is a very positive thing, but at the same time, a very apophatic thing. So it's kind of a negating way of talking about the positive that is God.
So she eventually falls in the abyss, but on her way there, does she ever lose the fear of damnation that triggered her desire to take on a religious lifestyle, or is it something that just continues to recur throughout the rest of her work?
Yes, you can definitely see that later on as well. She feels at times that she's entirely abandoned by God, even sort of replicating Christ's cry on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? But she kind of replicates that in her own words. But then she always kind of comes out of those states into even more positive states than she had before. So she has several reoccurrences, I should say, when she feels that she is abandoned by God and kind of destined for damnation. So that is definitely a recurring theme for Angela, that she always goes to sort of higher and higher states of finding her way out of that.
Well, at least she gets out eventually. We are coming to the end now, so there's just the one question that remains, which is, why is Angela of Foligno your favourite mystic?
I think for me, perhaps in a slightly broader question, part of the reason I'm attracted to the Franciscans in that way is that they're really at all, or certainly a lot of the revolutionary points of the 13th century church and 13th century theology. In the most commonly thought of form, are part of the mendicant movement as friars, sort of new religious orders. But also they're in the universities, especially at Paris and Oxford. They're in convents as female religious orders, and you can also have female expressions of Franciscanism as a penitent woman. And for me, Angela is a particularly interesting person to study because of that, because she's someone who has sort of no clear ecclesiastical position, no clear ecclesiastical status, and she has to carve out her own authority and her own identity. So she's someone who has no ecclesiastical tie to being a Franciscan, but someone who very much would consider herself to have that. And so she's someone who is part of this penitential movement, but also a 13th century woman who is very clearly doing theology. She's taking these concepts, some of the same concepts that scholastic theologians are talking about, and discussing them, and sometimes without exactly the same accuracy that they're using, or without exactly the same language, but she's still very much playing into these concepts, ideas of kenotic Christology, of annihilation, deification. So she is really kind of achieving this, and someone who definitely needs to be considered as a theologian as well as a mystic.
Would you trade places with Brother A for a day?
Not at all. I think he kind of had a bad time of it. He's someone who was very heavily criticized by Angela for his probably quite difficult work in helping her produce this book, and someone who she often says what he's written is really nothing or has no truth in it or doesn't resemble what she said at all. So he's someone who probably had quite a hard time of it, and someone who we as modern people don't even know his name.
So you don't want to be the anonymous guy who gets yelled at for getting everything wrong?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem like a very fun way to spend your time, but I hope this was. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today and for telling me a little bit more about Angela of Foligno and her theological prowess.
That's all right. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic and join me next time when I speak to James Roberts about Mother Maria Skeptsova.